let me welcome everybody to a long view conversation that we're delighted to be hosting here. I will mention, since it is for us at the Kennan Institute something of a historic week, that this is the launch of an independent Kennan Institute, and we are really delighted to have this event today, which we think of as part of the excitement of the launch. Before we dive in, I would like to thank Aldrin Ballesteros for making this conversation possible on the technical side. And I will now introduce our speakers. And since we have a lot of ground to cover, I think we will dive right in to the complicated, thorny subject that's at hand for us today. So Charles Hecker is a Russia analyst and author, and we're here to talk about his book, Zero Sum: The Arc of International Business in Russia. Thane Gustafson is a professor of political science at Georgetown University, and we're here as well to talk about his book, I'm skipping over the first part of the title. The subtitle is Russia's Failed Economic Opening, the Hurricane of War and Sanctions, and the Uncertain Future. Thane, can you remind me of what the opening words are?
Perfect storm.
Indeed, perfect storm. Russia's failed economic opening, the hurricane of war and sanctions, and the uncertain future. I'm Michael Kimmage, the director of the Kennan Institute. I'm joined by my Kennan Institute colleague, Maria Littman, for this conversation. And so I think with that, by way of introduction, let me turn to Maria for the first question to start us off.
Thank you, Michael. And it is my great pleasure and honor to be part of this conversation today with two brilliant authors, Thane Gustafson and Charles Hecker. But before I ask my first question, I would like to express my gratitude and my admiration to Michael Kimmage, who has been the main force behind this return, or should I say rebirth, of the Kennan Institute. And now to my first question. I'd like to ask each of you to say a few words about your experience with and in Russia, and also about the concepts of your respective books. How would you describe those concepts? The perfect storm and the zero sum, the arc from the improbable opening of Russia for Western business and its dramatic reclosure.
Charles, why don't you go ahead?
I'm happy to jump in, and let me also add my thanks and my congratulations to the Kennan Institute, and genuinely just express my gratitude for being invited to appear with you all today. Michael, thank you very much. Maria, thank you very much, and it's an honor to appear side by side with Professor Gustafson. Thane, it's a real pleasure. My own experience in Russia traces back to the Soviet Union when I first went as a student. And I went as a tourist on a number of occasions, studied language for the very first time in the Soviet Union in Leningrad in 1983, and then moved for the first time permanently to Russia in 1994 when I worked as a journalist for the Moscow Times, and then left journalism and went into consulting, and I worked for an international business risk consultancy and was the head of the Moscow office there for about 8 years, and started basically commuting back and forth between London and Moscow with an apartment in both cities. Kind of ideal situation, if you ask me. But basically, the task there for all of those years was helping FTSE 100 and Fortune 500 companies invest safely in Russia, in the sort of broadest concept of that word, safely. And the sort of the experience and the writing of the book, I think tries, as the subtitle suggests, to cover the arc of international business in Russia, and from the belief that basically good stories and good books have a specific beginning, a middle, and an end. And very sadly, the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine created a very messy end to the story of international business in Russia. I mean, not even really an end, but more like a coda, if you will. And so if you look at the beginning of the story, it was certainly the collapse of the Soviet Union and the absolute stampede into the Russian Federation by Western business. I think we all have a different version of what the high points were of that arc, but certainly the go-go days of the 2000s, when the price of oil was high, when Moscow was a major global capital city, Russia was host to the Olympics and the World Cup, and Russia and Russian business and Russian citizens were everywhere, in Hong Kong and London and New York and Zurich, all over the world doing business, and the country was generally integrating into the global economy. And then I just remember walking through the park one day here in London, and with the announcement of the full-scale invasion, and very sadly, what happened, sort of fell on me from the sky was the idea that this creates a narrative arc and creates a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Thane, over to you.
Well, thank you, and let me echo first of all the thanks and recognition to Michael and to Masha for what they've done in ensuring a new life for the Kennan Institute. So best wishes to both of you and to the Reborn Institute. Charles is absolutely right that these two books, Zero Sum and Perfect Storm, tell substantially the same story. That is to say, there's overlap in the events that they describe. My own background actually began with the International Exchange Program, the IREX, and my objective, my topic, was the politics of environment in the Soviet Union. Now we're in the early 70s, and when my advisor, Merle Feinsod, contacted the Ministry of Higher Education, said Gustafson wants to study the environment, basically their answer was, well, we don't have an environment. So, and of course that proved to be on many levels, hasn't changed since. But they did find somebody, a professor of natural resource law at, of all places, the State University of Kiev. And so I found myself in Kiev in the early 1970s, which was an extraordinary experience. But that's for another conversation. And then subsequently another year in Moscow at the Academy of Sciences. But that led to 10 years of teaching at Harvard following the unfortunate death of Professor Feinsod. And during that time, there was all through the 1970s and into the early 80s, even before the end of the Soviet Union, there was a mounting volume, intensity of exchange going on. For a number of those years, I was a consultant to the National Academy of Sciences. That led to trips of all kinds with delegations of American scientists. Those went both ways, the Soviets here. So there was a great deal of activity. The mutual opening preceded the end of the Soviet Union by easily a decade. Remember, we went through Gorbachev, Perestroika, and so on. So with the end of the Soviet Union, though, I started consulting for Daniel Yergin's group, the CIRA, and which is now part of S&P Global. I headed their Russia program for many years, and that involved in particular working on energy closely with BP, with Total to equal extent, and also with industry across the board. So a good deal of my story in Perfect Storm is focused on the oil industry, which was an odyssey of its own in those days, particularly with BP's very heavy involvement. But at the same time, I was in a very good position to observe what Charles was also observing, which was the rise of many, many professions that had simply not existed in the Soviet Union. And so a very important part of the story, I think, is the building on this vacuum of specialties in accounting, in entertainment, in law, and across several dozen professions, which simply had not existed in the Soviet Union because in the centrally planned system, there was no demand for them. And so Westerners poured in to basically create those businesses and those institutions that had not existed before. But an important part of the drama, which Charles and I both tell, is the arrival of young Russians moving into those companies. And then as the Westerners start to leave, taking them over and running them today. So those institutions exist now. And in that sense, the whole experience was transformative for Russia and remains so.
I'd like to follow up, Thane and Charles, with a question. I feel like you've touched on the edges of it, but I want to ask it directly, since I think shortly we're going to be moving to the darker parts of the story, indicated in both of your titles, right? Zero Sum and Perfect Storm, that these are not stories of placid times. But I do want to dwell a little bit on the positive side of the story, simply because it's so important for us, I think, to reflect on at the present moment, if only as a point of contrast between past and present. But two things that strike me as very interesting features of your book are, one, the optimism that people had, and the optimism, I'm thinking of Western businesses and Russians alike, looking at this economic interaction that develops in the 1990s as a subject of optimism. I can't quite remember in which book it appears, but there's the claim that businesses are about the future. And they're about investing in the future. And to have that mentality of investment, you have to believe in a certain kind of future. And so I want to ask about the kind of optimistic belief in the future that was there on both sides of the story, the Western side and the Russian side, but also to ask about instances of Russian-American or Russian-Western cooperation, of which there are many in your book, and sort of to reflect on the nature of that, the non-pathological, non-negative side of the story. And obviously, we're going to move to different terrain in just a few moments' time. But if I can start with you, Thane, about optimism or cooperation, or the two together, and then we'll turn to you, Charles.
Well, I agree, Michael, that there was a tremendous optimism. There was a sense of opportunity. I think everyone recognized that this was an extraordinary event, with the end not just of the Soviet Union, but the end of the whole ideology of central planning, of monopoly control by a party apparatus, top to bottom, through the whole country. And this was a Soviet Union that all of us had become used to, that the whole world had become used to, that had been a model elsewhere in China and so on. And all of a sudden it was gone. So I think that Charles captures it very nicely when he says that this was an identity, a collapse of a previous identity that had been central to Russia and to the other republics, of course, but Russia primarily. So to say optimism perhaps doesn't even quite capture it. It was the sense of a familiar universe breaking up. So what next? What then? And the sense of a vacuum in Russia, beginning, as I said, with the total absence of so many types of businesses that were brought in, along with the market economy. Now, I was also present on the ground a good deal outside of Moscow, up in oil country, out in West Siberia at Akadem Gradok, the academic city of the Academy of Sciences, and other places. And at the same time, I was aware that there was a great deal of anxiety, that the day-to-day relationships were always fraught. We're talking about two civilizations trying to find a common language. In the oil industry, this was particularly the case because the oil industry in the United States was even then on the cusp of a revolution, with the development of new technologies that transformed the U.S. oil industry. But those technologies had not been developed inside the Soviet Union. And there was very much an old school attitude, a very conservative industry, both in oil and also in gas. Gazprom was evolving at that time and was anything but progressive. Liquid natural gas had not developed in the Soviet Union yet. All of that came in all of a sudden, together with an oil services industry, Schlumberger and so on. And the arrival was not smooth. It was never smooth. So to say that it was like bubbly champagne I think that one has to qualify that. Yes, there was that element. Some champagne was being drunk, but some of it tasted fairly bitter.
I agree with everything that Thane has said. There was optimism. But I think it was the real optimism and the sense of opportunity, I think, was probably more on the micro level than on the macro level. And, the macro level in East-West and Russia-Western cooperation, I'll get to in a second, but there was genuine progress made, genuine optimism and genuine opportunity, not in 100% of all cases, but in quite a meaningful number of cases, there was progress made in the way East and West business interacted. And the way that both began, maybe initially reluctantly, and then maybe more smoothly, the way both began to learn from each other. And that's not easy. The learning took place over enormous geographical differences, enormous cultural differences, and enormous differences in business principles and what business is all about in the first place. Not to mention that expats rotate in and out of Russia in 2 to 3 year stretches for the most part. And that makes continuity very difficult. But I think on a business to business level, enormous opportunity was created and the optimism was there. Expats were spending more and more time living and working in Russia. And there was, as Thane mentioned in his opening remarks, these professions that didn't exist in the Soviet Union, an entire sort of consultancy industry, a legal industry, a financial services industry, and the accountancy industry, genuinely became sort of multi-ethnic and was helping Russian business grow on a global scale and doing IPOs on the London Stock Exchange or on the New York Stock Exchange. Those were times of great optimism. They were also times of enormous risk. Bringing companies onto, a public capital market is a very risky move. And, there was a lot of work done to get a lot of Russian companies listed in London and New York. And those themselves are gestures, they're aspirational gestures in a way. They're gestures where the optimism is sort of built in. Sort of let's get on the exchange and take it from there. So there was that sort of optimism, I think, more on sort of the micro level, the person to person, the business person to business person, the company to company level. On the macro level, on sort of more broader kind of capital letters, Russia-Western cooperation. I mean, yeah, but this is where geopolitics and big politics sort of sometimes gets in the way. And so, yes, Russia was in the G8. That was a big move. And, Russia took a seat at sort of the big boys global table that it had lost after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Of course, Russia was then ejected from the G8 and it returned to being the G7. There was great East-West cooperation in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 on security and intelligence sharing and sharing of bases and technology and airspace. There was that. But I don't think that was durable and long lasting. And I think what we have to avoid, and I tried very hard in my book, and all the people who are in the book, we tried very hard to avoid using the luxury of hindsight, and being retrospective in all of this to say, well, it could have gone a lot better and it didn't. But I think that's the case. Keeping, slowly and then quickly, as the 2000s progressed, the concept of Russia-West cooperation on the macro level, I think, became increasingly fraught.
Wonderful. And I'm delighted to see questions coming into the Q&A function. Please keep them coming. And Maria, over to you.
Michael, you tried to ask the questions so that the answers would be optimistic. But I think we didn't exactly get that from our two guests today. They were not as upbeat as you expected. So I will not even try. And I will ask Thane to speak a little bit about the beginning of the cooperation, something that you describe in your book, saying that the opening was flawed from the start. So my question to you is, what was it that was flawed from the start? And my question to Charles is, could you please describe the atmosphere? What the situation was that the newcomers from the West, the financiers, the consultants, the businessmen were facing? You call them riskophiles. Why riskophiles? And I think I too do not quite remember which was in what book, but I think one of you wrote, what were they thinking? They were coming, they being, of course, Western, yours. Okay. Continuation to your question. Those Westerners who were coming to Russia, that was so immensely different, such an immensely different experience during the previous decades. Were they at all aware of where they were coming? What were they thinking? But of course, the question goes to Thane about flawed from the start.
Well, Masha, when I said flawed from the beginning, what I had in mind particularly was the expectations. And so the expectations on the part of the Westerners who came into Russia was that they were coming to a place that was going to embrace democracy, embrace relations with the West, become part of the globalization that was then the you might say the ruling ideology in the West at the time. And at the same time, the Russians themselves also had tremendous expectations. But I think that from the beginning, the Russians understood that the collapse of the Soviet Union was something that had come from within. It was the failure of the Soviet model that was uppermost in the minds of the Russians, and consequently, their first concern was to build in this vacuum, as Charles very aptly calls it, and not necessarily by any means to join the West, and certainly not to make concessions to join the West. And here's where the business part of the story is just next door and overlaps with the geopolitical part of the story. I think certainly by 2007, by the time of the famous Munich conference and Putin's very bitter speech at that conference, by that time the geopolitical side, which was always rocky and which faced also conflicts and expectations, by that time, by 2007, had already started to turn sour, and the disappointments and feelings that arose, particularly on the part of the Russian population after their contact with Westerners, who frequently didn't understand Russia, didn't speak Russian, etc. I think those spilled over into the geopolitical and gave Putin ample, shall we say, fodder for his own policies of resentment and pushback. So the failure is both on the economic and social side, civilizational, you might say, and on the geopolitical. And in that sense, the flaws were built in from the beginning.
Maria, before I say anything, you'll have to forgive me for two things. First of all, there will be a certain amount of nostalgia in my remarks about what the atmosphere was like in the early days. And then also some of my remarks will be mostly Moscow-centric because that's where I was. And I think that's where, the overwhelming majority of the business community was. And I suppose we do have to remember that what was happening in Moscow was dramatically different from what was happening almost everywhere else in the country, sort of politically, economically, and socially. But, the atmosphere for newcomers, Asha, was electrifying. In spite of, being a country with centuries of history in both the Tsarist period and the Soviet period, Russia, starting in 1992, was a very young and very hormonal country. One very much got the sense that in spite of all of this history, this was a country that was making it up as it went along, that it was reinventing itself literally, from day to day and week to week and month to month. And there was something exhilarating about that. Phrases that, sort of whatever's not forbidden is allowed. And, the word that was used to sort of characterize that time, bespredel, there's a sort of sense of kind of rulelessness or limitlessness to what was going on, and the chaos that was one of the primary features of the 1990s. If you had a strong stomach, in many senses of the word, it was a great place to be. And I guess that's why the concept of the riskophile, which, thank you for noting that, is so important to the business story in Russia, because at the end of the day, risk is sort of the adrenaline of business, and risk is sort of one of the things that drives a lot of business people. And so the word riskophile actually came up in an interview that I did for the book with a friend who was on the management committee of Raiffeisen Bank for a number of years before leaving the country. And he said that the managers of Raiffeisen Bank, and perhaps this rings true even to this day, but the managers of Raiffeisen Bank back then were riskophiles, because amid the banking collapse of the 1998 government debt default and the 1998 financial crisis, Raiffeisen essentially doubled down on Russia and stayed, and not only stayed, but grew, and essentially picked up the remains of the banking sector that was left after the crash of 1998. And so it really does take a riskophile and somebody with a very long-term strategic view to withstand the 1998 crisis when pretty much everybody else left, and then to make money off of it. And maybe that describes the current philosophy of Raiffeisen Bank, which of course is a lightning rod for controversy and regulatory pressure for still being in Russia and for being one of the few financial institutions that's facilitating transfers in and out of the country, although its services in Russia are shrinking. So I think, I just think that it was an exciting place to be. It was dangerous. It was risky. It was everything all at once. But, maybe just to go back to Michael's original question, there was an air of opportunity and optimism. And I don't mean to be a pessimist about this. Both of our books are books about things that might have been. And in all of that is the essence of the optimism. And that is that what might have been still might be. And maybe that's a good way to end this particular answer.
All right. Well, to pick up at exactly that point, and to start with you, Charles, this time, Thane, you mentioned Westerners coming to Russia without language knowledge and without a lot of knowledge of the country and its culture. Now, one of the most readily available mythic stories and true stories of Russian history is Peter the Great going to work as a young man in the Dutch shipyards for the sake of gaining access to European Western technology to create the Russian Navy and to augment the power of the Russian military. And you can come up with, thousands of examples of similar such moves in the period from Peter the Great to the period that you describe in your books. And so under the rubric of what were they thinking, how could people come to Russia in the 1990s and not be aware or not be fully aware that economics and geopolitics are inevitably going to mix? And that the story that they were a part of was perhaps their personal professional story and the story of Western banking and investment and all of that. But again, inevitably, it was a sort of Russian geopolitical story that they were a part of from the beginning. Benefit of hindsight for sure in the asking of the question. And yet it does seem like such a blunt and simple question that I suspect that people looking back in the future are going to be asking it persistently. So Charles, if we could start there, why was geopolitics seemingly less visible than it should have been at the time?
Yeah, thank you for that, Michael. And you're absolutely right. I mean, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And what were we thinking is the first sentence in Zero Sum, and what were we collectively thinking in going in and getting involved in this? And the book, there's a chapter of what international business was like in Russia during the Tsarist period, what it was like there's a chapter on business in the Soviet period. And it was remarkable to discover, or at least to confirm my hunch, that there were several similar strands running through these periods and a great deal of historical continuity from century to century and business to business and sector to sector. So why did we go in the 1990s knowing what we knew? And why were we perhaps not more cautious, or, why didn't we take certain things into consideration? I mean, because to a certain extent, the book is about assumptions and, the validity of the assumptions that we made about Russia and how often we tested those assumptions and how long they remain valid. But Michael, here's what was happening. In the 1990s, the world was approaching a peak of globalization. And businesses around the world were going to places that they had never before considered as markets or as places for their supply chains or as places for their back offices. Companies were doing business in places of varying new levels of risk as a result of this overall trend of globalization. And Russia fit into that perfectly. And in fact, Russia was labeled as, one of the world's most important and one of the world's biggest emerging markets. And, before globalization, we used to call places like that, sort of either third world countries or second world countries. And there was a great global rebranding of countries like that. Countries that we used to call third world countries became emerging markets. Emerging markets are incredibly investable. Third world countries don't sound quite so investable. And so that made things a little bit more palatable. And then just a couple of things to finish. Never underestimate, and this came up again and again and again in the book, and that is, never underestimate the distorting effect of competitive pressure on business. And that is, once a couple of companies, there was this huge stampede at the beginning, but once companies started to go in and started to make money, companies that didn't go to Russia started to look negligent, or as if they were missing an opportunity. Why are you overlooking? We're going to Brazil, we're going to India, we're going to China. Why aren't we going to Russia? Pepsi is in Russia, Coke needs to be there. McDonald's is in Russia, Burger King needs to be there. And these are, sort of trite cliches, but true. And so, the sort of surge of globalization swept everyone into Russia, I think, at the same time anyway. There were companies that went in with their eyes wide open to politics and geopolitics, geoeconomics and political economy, for sure. I think one of the other things that we learned, and I'll just end with this, is that we learned that companies don't look at countries as countries. Companies look at countries as markets. And when you're looking at a place as a market, you're looking at something very, very different from when you're looking at a place as a country. And I think the overwhelming majority of companies that went into Russia saw it as a market. And it ended there.
Oh, that's great. And there are quite a few questions already in the chat about whether it will be possible to view Russia as a market again in the future. So we'll return to exactly that subject in a couple of minutes. Thane, the question about geopolitics, over to you.
First of all, as a parenthesis, I think it's important to pay tribute to the role that the U.S. government played throughout this period in advising, in promoting institution building, in enlisting the U.S. private sector in areas such as law and accounting and so on to come to Russia with government funding and government grants to start to fill that void that we talked about at the outset. And that, I think, was very important and very constructive. And particularly as we think to current developments in American politics, I think that that happened because of the leadership of the time. So that's an important point, I think, to make. A second theme question in response to what Charles said, I think, is the generational aspect. The people who were most ambivalent about the arrival of the West were the older generation and people who were in established positions. I don't mean retirees. I mean people who were themselves in positions of power. But what started to happen very soon as a direct byproduct of the presence of the Western companies in Russia was the recruitment of a younger generation of Russians into initially the junior positions in these many different fields, in particular the ones that had not existed in the Soviet Union before. The young generation, many of them increasingly having gone to school in the West, or who started out in the Moscow offices of Western businesses, Ernst & Young, et cetera, that kind of business. And then gradually over this period, they become more senior, they are more experienced, they learn the lingo, they absorb the practices, and this is the practices of the parent companies, not necessarily in corrupt form, but with a certain enthusiasm of discovery. And I think what this leads to is a very big question, because those same people gradually took over those companies when the Westerners left. This was partly because they were cheaper than the expats, so the home offices we're we're glad to have the young Russians come in. But the result of that is that by the time the Westerners really leave, the Russians take over. And so you have Western brand names that get rebranded in the hands of this new generation. And the big question, I think, for us to, as we look into the future, will be what will be the impact of this generation change, which has not gotten much commentary, I think, because these younger Russians are still rising within the system. But in the 2030s, they will have reached the senior positions. They will take over. Will they necessarily be the compliant stooges that we have seen around Putin right now? What will it look like when Putin disappears, however that happens, 10, 15 years from now? We're going to see a very important generation change. Lastly, a comment on the riskophiles. Charles already touched on this, and I think it's very important. The end of the Soviet Union came at a time of transformation of Western businesses on a whole lot of different fronts, technological, commercial, legal, etc. Just to take the oil industry, for example, I've already mentioned the rise of new techniques such as fracking and the like, or LNG in the gas industry, liquid natural gas. But let me just turn to one example that Russian citizens were very much aware of, and that was the takeover of an existing automobile factory by Renault under Carlos Ghosn. Now, this was a very risky thing to do, but it was part of Ghosn's remodeling of Renault around a whole new business concept in the automobile empire, in the automobile industry worldwide. That is to say, setting up assembly plants in emerging markets all over the world. And Ghosn was one of the leaders in that. Enormous risk-taking. John Brown of BP was a risk-taker. BP, by the way, made a great deal of money at the outset and then lost a tremendous amount of money in the denouement. So the word risk, Charles, is well taken.
Thank you so much. So Maria, let's turn to you. And I think this will be the last of our questions because there are so many in the chat. And please send more if you'd like, and I'll begin collating them and we'll bring them to our speakers after Maria asks her question.
I am, of course, taking what Charles said about businessmen are looking at markets, not countries. However, I think Russia as a country was changing quite substantially when Putin became the president of Russia. And actually, that was the time when the state was reemerging, as was habitual in Russia through centuries, as a behemoth. And those working in Russia, those Western businessmen, were forced to somehow get adjusted to that. In your book, Charles, you write that early Putin was seen by some businessmen as barm. That was the word you used, as a law and order president. But then it was changing. How was business, Western business, when Western finances, how were they adjusting to that? And you have this phrase in your book that some Western companies were very, very capable of accommodating bad things. So I would like both of you to talk about the West actually at that point, Western business, learning from Russians rather than the other way around. And what were the bad things?
Shall I start? I just want to sort of take a note from Thane's remarks about the U.S. government, and just for 2 seconds, go back to Michael's initial question about why companies went in. I should have added at the time that our governments were also telling us to go. They were saying, this is a new democracy, this is a new economy, go, invest, make this a stable place and integrate it into the global economy. So that was the other driver of the Western presence in Russia. Maria, so Western business people and Russian business people learned an awful lot from each other. And this is particularly where I discuss how joint ventures did and didn't work in Russia. because joint ventures are by their nature very, very unstable molecules. And you have a Western half and you have a Russian half. And the Western half brings money and brings know-how and equipment. And the Russian half is, the on-the-ground knowledge and the networks and the know-how and sort of the linguistic skills and everything else. And, the two sides of those equations often didn't value each other properly. When they were able to bridge that gap, it worked brilliantly. When they weren't, it was tragic. And so, there was learning, there was cross-fertilization, but it wasn't easy. And I remember, you said that, Putin was seen as a balm to Western business, from the book. That's right, because it is difficult to overstate it, particularly towards the late 90s in the aftermath of the crisis. It's difficult to overstate the level of chaos that there was in the Russian economy. And Putin was seen as a law and order president. And there was a great sense of relief. Finally, somebody's going to grasp this reckless country and bring it under control. And I'm exaggerating, but, and I think overlooking the fact that, Putin did not come from a place that is normally known as a breeding ground for economic and political reform. He's a graduate of the security services. And so maybe some of that confidence was misplaced. The confidence was bolstered, though, by the fact that Putin surrounded himself with a lot of people who were incredibly palatable to the West in their political ideas and in their economic ideas, and political, legal, and tax reform that was happening in the early years was genuinely embraced by the West and seen as highly progressive. Just to sort of end on this one, Westerners were adjusting. There was an early, initial, and severe crisis in this adjustment process. And I think one of the first warning signals maybe about Putin and what we were trying to adjust to, and that was the arrest of Khodorkovsky, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the CEO of Yukos. Western business had no idea how to interpret this. For some companies, it was like, well, we have nothing to worry about. For other companies, this was a disaster and the cause of mass panic. Really, phone calls back home to the headquarters saying, "Are we going to be next? And what does this mean?" And the waters got increasingly muddy when, the Russian leadership was saying, "Well, look, if you're a shoe manufacturer, Yukos means nothing for you. But if you're in a strategic sector, then Yukos means an awful lot for you as a Western investor." And then there was this mass confusion about what is a strategic sector and who determines what a strategic sector is and how big are we in, we have a 10% stake in a company that's a part of a strategic sector. What does this mean for us? Are we all going to be arrested? So it was always sort of two steps forward, one step back. And I, again, don't mean to be pessimistic. I suppose I'm just trying to be realistic.
Thane, would you please add your perspective to that? How do you reconcile the highly progressive advisors that, as Charles said, Putin has surrounded himself with, and the bad things that the Western business had to accommodate?
Well, when we talk about bad things, there's a whole other face to the reopening of Russia that we haven't talked about yet, which is the massive arrival of Russians in the West. And this took any number of different forms. It was just as varied as the Western arrival in Russia. But think about it, go down the list. There was, first of all, Londongrad, and practically the takeover of the London real estate market by Russian money. There was the arrival of Russian organized crime in a number of places around the world, but spectacularly in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn, and New York. And there was also the arrival of Russian banks. There was a transformation of the aviation industry, or I should say the airlines industry, with the development of massive leasing operations based in Ireland that were mediated by the Russians and for Aeroflot, but also for the new privately owned aviation companies that sprang up in Russia. And then finally, the whole saga of Gazprom. And we forget that this was not simply a matter of Russian gas exports into a naive Germany. This was a massive takeover of the gas industry in Germany by Gazprom in alliance with BASF, essentially creating a parallel gas industry at a time of the liberalization that was being promoted by the common market by Brussels. The whole German gas industry was turned upside down, and a number of subsidiary industries along with it. Gazprom used its platform in Germany to spread out all across Europe, into the UK, into France, in the Netherlands. Gazprom had an enormous setup in the Netherlands from which it built its empire throughout the world. Now, when we talk about the reactions of Westerners, first of all, this was unexpected, but from law enforcement to real estate to the energy world, I think Westerners on the whole were confronted with a very aggressive, no holds barred. Those two words I think will describe it. And the reaction was, I think, negative on the whole on the part of the Westerners who witnessed this onslaught, and that too contributed to a certain disillusionment in the West vis-a-vis Russia, not just the Russian government, but also Russian business.
All right, we turn now to the questions of our very curious audience, the proliferating questions of our curious audience. And so there are so many, and with apologies to the audience for not going through each question individually, I'm going to distill them down into three core questions, and so we'll sort of work them through in turn. The first is about the role of Western economists, sometimes referred to as the Harvard School, but it's a larger group than that. This is a question about shock therapy and the kind of wiring of the Russian economy that Western economists played some role in. I can't help but ask or mention in this, because it does link past to present, the figure of Jeffrey Sachs, who has very strong views on, the war in Ukraine, sort of from the pro-Russian side, which is sort of interesting and may not be causally connected to the kinds of policies he was advocating in the 1990s. But we'll start with you, Thane. I guess the question really is about how, looking back, you would assess, first of all, the nature of the advice that was given, but also, because this really takes us to the core of both of your books, it's about the interaction of two different worlds, or Thane, I think, as you said, two separate civilizations, but about the interaction of these economists with Russian counterparts in the government, both those who are receptive to the kind of free market ideas that they were putting forward, and then those that found themselves critical. But a backwards glance at the Western economists. And let's start with you, Thane, and then we'll turn to you, Charles.
Well, once again, I think the Western context is enormously important here. The economics profession and relatedly economic policy making was very much under the intellectual influence, the imprint of the University of Chicago and the revival, the neoliberal revival, which was so important, so revolutionary in American regulatory practice, and in the advice that was being given to the U.S. government, the philosophies that were being put in place in the Federal Reserve System and the like. The University of Chicago ruled all. It too invaded Europe through Margaret Thatcher, who became a true believer, and throughout the world. Neoliberal economics then rolled into Russia like a tidal wave, and there again found a vacuum. Now, this process actually began well before the collapse of the Soviet Union. People like German Greff in St. Petersburg, the St. Petersburg team of economists who surrounded Putin in those early years, and we remember the very liberal, business-oriented mayor of St. Petersburg, Anatoly Sobchak, for whom Putin first worked in the mayoralty of St. Petersburg. All of those people were very much influenced by neoliberal economics as transmitted through places like Hungary. So there was a current that turned out to be tremendously influential and that was conveyed by economists.
Thank you so much, Thane. Let's turn to you, Charles.
Michael, I'll try really, really hard to avoid hindsight in giving this answer. But so two things on that, and that is that, as much sort of damage, as we saw that the transition did to the Russian economy in the early days, we should remember that, yeah, and a lot of that damage was inflicted from the outside. But there was largely consensus that this was the way to go. And even at the time, Russia itself was in the middle of its own sort of homemade 500-day plan of fairly radical reforms and fairly accelerated change. And so the fact that, I think a lot of what was happening in retrospect is regrettable. But the second thing is we have a contemporaneous account of what was happening that we only learned about last year. And that was, I think, honestly, it's almost about a year ago to the day that the Wayne Merry telegram was declassified by the State Department as a result of, I believe it was an FOIA request that came out of Georgetown.
Troublemakers.
And Wayne Merry was a political officer in the American embassy in Moscow at the time, and this is in 1993 or 94, I think. And he said, look, U.S. policy on the political side is by and large doing the right things, and we're getting it right. But he wrote back to the State Department, to D.C., he wrote back saying, on the economic side, we're getting it all wrong very badly. And as we know now, that telex was very badly received, was classified, its distribution was diverted from its intended recipients, and sent to, and had to be submitted through the dissent channel, and then vanished. Wayne Merry's career, as he's described a year or so ago, ended as a result of that. And I think he makes a very strong point contemporaneously, and that is that, we were doing the right thing politically, pushing the right buttons diplomatically, but getting it all very badly wrong economically.
Just as a quick add-on to that, there's a counterpoint here to the founding moment of the Kennan Institute with the long telegram from Kennan. And so here we have two bookends, so to speak, the long telegram from Wayne Merry.
Wonderful. Thane, thank you for pointing it out. We do at the Kennan Institute specialize in telegrams, and one might add, just for the record, rather famous, sort of often cited, I don't know if it was a telegram, it was a cable from Ambassador Bill Burns describing responses in the Russian national security elite to the question of NATO and NATO expansion. I suppose one could write a history of the U.S.-Russian relationship as a history of telegrams, and we would get, quite some distance. Charles, we'll start with you. This is the second to last question, and I'll just, sort of give you some warning that the third and final question will be about the future, and your thoughts about where things might trend in the future. But before we get there, I want to bundle, sort of two basic interests of our audience together into a two-part question. And one, I think we've touched on this topic already, but about oligarchs and crime. One of our audience members writes about the book Vori, I think by Mark Galeotti, if I remember correctly, about sort of oligarchic criminal structures that were present in the 1990s and didn't vanish, although it changed, of course, when Putin came to power, so that where that fits in the narrative. And then secondly, a very interesting question about which entities or institutions in Russia were the first to demonstrate skepticism / hostility toward the West? Because surely it wasn't a story where just a switch was flipped on the 24th of February, 2022, and everything suddenly came to an end. It has to be a more intricate, complicated story than that. We're probably, different interactions with different parts of Russian society, business world, government, each had, sort of different logic. So the question, first part, sort of crime, oligarchs, and then second, the story of the unraveling of this relationship between Western businesses and Russia. So Charles, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Michael. The topic of organized crime, and particularly Mark Galeotti's excellent book, Vori, is one of these continuous strands through, again, even in Tsarist history, through the Soviet period, and then into, early Russian political and economic and social history. It's something that has always been present. And I think that, and you talk about the sort of symbiotic relationship or symbiotic and maybe convenient or necessary relationship between oligarchic structures and criminal structures. In some cases, the line between the two was extremely blurry or didn't exist. In some cases, it was a little bit more distinct. But I think this fits in that, this period of chaos in the 1990s when Russia was rewriting its legal statutes. And what happened instead was that, paying attention to the law didn't really get you very far in Russia. The black and white of legal world was enormously dysfunctional. And so navigating the gray world of influence rather than a strictly legalistic approach took on many shapes. And one of the levers of influence was the use of criminal structures. And I think that it's valid to say that, the Soviet five-year plan was one of the world's most dysfunctional economic systems. And the only way that it worked, to the extent that it worked, was through, shortcuts and side deals and workarounds and compromises that were the grease in the system. And I think when Russia and its external helpers tried to build a market economy in Russia, the response wasn't entirely, well, great. Here's a system where we're all working on an even playing field and it'll be transparent and it'll be open and anybody who wants to can succeed. It was more sort of like, okay, here's a new economic system. What are the shortcuts and what are the workarounds? And I think one of those was the use of criminality. On the subject of hostility to Western business, you're right. It wasn't as if a switch flipped in 2022. And one of the examples that I sort of want to bring is much earlier than that. And that is in the privatization process. And again, I'm going back to the 1990s a little bit, and you'll remember the Red Directors, who, when, introduced to privatization and introduced to foreign capital, were enormously hostile to this idea. Or at least, they were quite welcoming of the cash injection, but were quite hostile to the idea of surrendering control. What do you mean you want a new CEO? Or what do you mean you want seats on the board of directors? Or, what do you mean that you want to be able to vote on company strategy? Give me your money and then please go away. And I think that, this was an example of something many decades ago already, that came and went. And, there were periods of hostility, periods of symbiosis, and then the periods of hostility, but they were always there, again, on the micro level, enterprise by enterprise and business person by business person, I think.
And Charles, what you describe in Microcosm, if I put the two books together and we go back to the 1880s, 1890s, it's actually a much longer story of opening and closing and interaction and scaled back interaction. It's an extremely complicated pattern over 120 years, if not more, of history, the sort of arrival of capitalism in Russia, and then sequential chapters in this history. So if there are any graduate students watching, that might be something to think about as a kind of long-term historical project. Charles, and then.
Oh, no, but I was just going to say, by the way, thank you very much for the new book idea, a book about telegrams.
Right. And, in addition to the telegram idea, Thane, thoughts about organized crime, oligarchs on the one hand, and then the breakdown in relations between Russia and Western business prior to and leading up to 2022.
I'm going to take a chance and venture the thought that at least the Russian face in the West, even though we were very conscious of organized crime, was actually more of an irritant than a fundamental cause. I think one reason for that is that the Russian underworld faced competition from the underworlds of the rest of the world in the United States and so forth. And consequently, maybe in the end, although it was visible in the newspapers, much commented on, was perhaps not as fundamental as some other aspects of the Russian arrival in the West. It was fundamental, however, in the story of Western business in Russia, and the whole story, of course, of reform and marketization inside Russia. And the real story, I think, there is the way that the Putin regime enlisted, co-opted organized crime, particularly at the local levels, at the regional levels. Organized crime became a government organized crime at the local levels, taken over by the law enforcement bodies at the province level and at the local level. And that's one of the tragedies, I think, of the failed opening. Since we're nearly at the end of our time, I'm going to take advantage of that to hold on to the microphone for 1 second more. First of all, to hold up the book, and I don't know if it's visible, but there it is. And the old motto is, be sure you show the book. So by golly, I'm showing the book. But also just to say 1/3 of the book or more is devoted to sanctions and which sanctions have worked and which have not, and so on. And I hope we do come back perhaps and have a follow-up conversation and address that aspect of things. We haven't talked about China yet. There's a lot to be said about that. But just to rejoin the sanctions question with the rest of our conversation, the sanctions in a headline turn out to be effective in some sectors and not in others. And this rejoins the theme that Charles and I have both developed, which is that there wasn't a single opening of Russia. The opening was different depending on which sector you are talking about. And so financial sanctions hit the Russian financial sector one way because of its special history of the opening. The oil sanctions hit Russia in a different way because of its separate path during the opening, and so on. And consequently, as we come back to sanctions, as I hope we will, then in a later conversation, why I think that might be an opening theme on how to explain which sanctions work and which sanctions do not.
I'm grateful to you, Thane, for mentioning sanctions and also for reminding me that this is, in fact, the first installment of a two-part conversation. So we will be returning at some point, still to be scheduled in the new year, to flesh out many themes. And I can see from the number of questions from the audience that this is really important to have adequate time to cover all that these two remarkable books have to author. So it's a little bit like the Brothers Karamazov. That's in fact the first volume of a proposed 3-volume trilogy. And in our case, we're going to get to the second installment. But on that, just stay tuned. But I do want to ask the final question that comes from our audience, which I do think is a nice occasion to tie up some loose threads. And we'll start with you, Thane, and then turn to Charles. And so a number of questioners asked from the chat about when or whether it will be possible to return to a robust relationship between Western business and Russia. And one might tack on as a footnote to that it's not as if all business has come to an end. There certainly are still Western businesses in Russia. And if you take a kind of indirect view of the subject and look at flows going through Kazakhstan and other countries in terms of trade and also financial flows, there might be more Western business in Russia than meets the eye. At the moment, there is more Western business in Russia than meets the eye. So with that caveat that it's not zero, although it may be zero sum, let's start with you, Thane, about future prospects and whether some kind of normalization is conceivable.
Well, four quick points. The first, we're talking about the mid to late 2030s. Second, we're talking about which sanctions will be rolled back and how. And Charles' book is great on that subject with his conversations with Ravi Abdelal. Third, it'll depend very much on whether the niches have been filled by Russian entrepreneurs and companies. And the answer there is that most of the niches will have already been filled. There's no room for the Westerners to return, not on the same scale as before. And then finally, last point, it'll vary very much by country. Raiffeisen has never left. The Italians have left less than others, shall we say. Germany, parts of the business sector in Germany might be tempted to go back in, after all, a couple centuries of relationship there, and so on. The Americans might be the last to return.
That seems very, very plausible to me. So, Charles, you can close us out on the question of future prospects, and I'm delighted to think that we have the chance for a return to all of this and perhaps a bit more in a few months.
Thank you, Michael. Just in addition to everything that Thane said, which I agree with, and I think the sanctions conversation is going to be fascinating because one of the things that I think about is asymmetrical sanctions relief and what that might mean between the US, the UK, and the EU and the rest of the G7 countries that sanction, or the relief of sectoral sanctions. It's a fascinating question. On the future, heavy sigh, deep breath. We know that there will be a future. Precisely because, as you pointed out, Michael, by a long shot, not every Western business has left Russia. And some of the businesses that stayed say that they're doing quite well and feeling relatively comfortable. I think that there's pushback on that argument available. But there is an international business community that has remained in Russia. The second thing that we know is that the companies that left want to go back. And so we know that there will be a future, because earlier this year, when Presidents Trump and Putin were on the phone, and then around the time when they met in Anchorage, the business community was getting quite excited, because the scent of sanctions relief was in the air, and the possibility of some sort of return, at least was, the idea of planning for something was surfacing again. And we also know that the companies that left Russia on their own and through their professional services providers are still in touch. They are keeping a very, very close watch on what's happening on the ground in Russia now, and thinking about what's happening in the future. I think that it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And then I think beyond that, it's a question of how. And I'd like to know, and I'd like to learn, what lessons Western companies have taken on board as a result of the past, not just the past 30 years, but the past almost now 4 years. And whether, as you suggested in one of your earlier questions, Michael, do we all just run in again, as we did at the very beginning in the 1990s? My sense is that there will be and has to be a safer way for business to return, and that we won't see the same physical and financial footprint on the ground that we did when companies left. And I think, if anything, we might go back in the same way that we did in the 1990s, and that is from a safer distance, without the massive office buildings, the massive factories, the input of capital. I think it might be a slightly more remote control sort of operation, to keep things at a safe distance. So much has to happen between now and the timeline that Thane has set out. So much has to happen that we remain unsure about. But as to the future, there will be one. That is unquestionable. And I think that there will come a time when we will get a chance to make that.
Thank you, Charles, for that. And it won't be possible to have a full conversation about this without drawing China into the purview, because the mix of geopolitics and economics that we've been talking about for the past hour and 15 minutes applies very much to China, and will modify, I think, the way all of this plays out in the future in terms of the U.S., Europe, and Russia. Let me repeat the names of the two books by way of conclusion: by Charles Hecker, Zero Sum, The Arc of International Business in Russia, and by Thane Gustafson, Perfect Storm, Russia's Failed Economic Opening, The Hurricane of War and Sanctions, and the Uncertain Future. There you have it, Thane, the uncertainty of the future at the very conclusion of our conversation. Do stay tuned for the second installment of this discussion, which will come in the short to medium term. And great thanks to our two speakers today for joining us and for so beautifully launching us at the end of this launch week for the Kennan Institute. And great thanks as well to my colleague Maria Lippman for joining for this conversation. So thank you so much, and stay tuned.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure.